So yeah, in this episode on the El Dorado project, we have Lindall's bow tie cut Omega rotors and Z Plus brake pads. Founded in 1998 by Paul Cottrell Jr., Lyndall Racing Brakes, a family-run business for over 25 years, have been producing the highest quality performance braking combinations on the market today. Well known across the motorcycle, UTV, ATV community, and well respected on the track, to include the Hooligan Flat Track and King of the Baggers, Lindall has continued to develop and outperform the rest. Combining aesthetics with high performance by using the finest materials and CNC processes to manufacture fully floating three-piece rotors, brakes, wheels, and sprockets, all backed by 100% customer satisfaction and proudly made here in the USA. Lindall is also a proud distributor of Brembo products that include radial calipers, master cylinders, and more. Now the rotor and brake combination I chose to go with are Lindall's bow tie cut Omega rotors and Z Plus brake pads. A full floating high carbon steel rotor, CNC machined to exact tolerances and thoroughly tested to ensure maximum performance in the most extreme environments and conditions. These lug drive rotors feature a highly advanced, unique three-piece design, which consists of the inner carrier. This is your center aesthetic portion. The outer friction ring. This is where your rotor and brake pads meet. This can easily be changed out or serviced without having to remove the entire rotor or carrier. Which brings us to the third piece of this design, the helical retaining ring. This ring securely fastens the friction ring to the carrier in a way that it prevents the rotor from becoming loose or noisy compared to your traditional button style rotor. Lindall rotors come in a variety of styles and finishes. If you choose to go with a black or gold friction ring, they do recommend pairing them with the Lindall's Z Plus brake pads to help maintain that finish. Now these finishes do not improve brake performance, and over time they do wear, and depending on what brake pads you're using, the gas slots and edges of the rotor that do not make contact with the brake pads will always maintain their color. This brings us to the Lindall brake pads. Made up of organic, non-sintered compounds and are available in 3 different compounds that cater to different riding styles and environments. These compounds include Z Plus, Gold Plus, and Extreme. The Z Plus pads will deliver 5% more stopping power than stock with zero dust or noise. They run 30% cooler and 50% lighter than sintered pads. Overall, these are a great choice if you want more stopping power than stock, and if you're looking to preserve the black or gold friction ring finish. The next step up in performance is the Gold Plus. This is a harder pad than the Z Plus with 20% more stopping power than stock. It runs cooler with little to no noise or dust and will provide a noticeable increase in stopping power. And lastly, the Extreme series. This is Lindall's most advanced, highest level of friction brake pads, providing 30% more stopping power than stock sintered pads. So Z Plus is catered more for your average everyday rider looking for more stopping power than stock. Gold Plus is more for your everyday rider, weekend warrior. And the Extreme is specific to your performance bagger or racer. And all 3 compounds are guaranteed for 18,000 miles. So what's the difference between a solid rotor and a floating rotor? Solid rotors are one piece cut from a solid piece of steel. Now because this is a one-piece design, the heat plays a major factor in the way your rotor will function as it increases in diameter and thickness. As you squeeze or press the brakes, the friction between the brake pads and rotor will create heat, which will cause your steel rotor to expand. Now your rotor will increase in thickness and diameter, but will not expand uniformly. This is because the disc will be hottest on the outside, where it will stay cooler on the inside. And these inconsistencies can cause your rotor to warp. Now, floating rotors are a two-piece design consisting of a steel rotor blade and a carrier, usually made out of aluminum. These are held together with rivets or with Lindall's cold ring retaining system. These rivets or ring retainers maintain an air gap between the rotor and the carrier, which allows a rotor to float above the carrier. This improves pad alignment, which in turn improves braking power. And when you need to replace the friction ring, you can easily reuse the carrier and just replace the ring. So I know that's a lot of information to take in, but anytime you're dealing with Lyndall brakes, you're getting the best product on the market. So there is a lot to be said. Other than that, guys, I'm excited to get these installed, so let's go. So here I have the gold titanium rotor bolts. I do have 2 sets for the front and 1 set for the rear. So there is a noticeable size difference for the front screws and the rear screws, so you can't really mix them up. The front screws are smaller and the rear screws are bigger. So here I have Lindall's Z+ brake pads. I have 2 sets for the front and 1 set for the rear. So I did purchase new caliper pins. Whenever you service your brake pads, you definitely want to change these out. They come with a pin and a new retaining clip. Here I have the front rotor. They do have an install guide on the back in case you had any other questions. Here I have the rear rotor. Same thing, you'll have an install guide on the back. So first thing I'll do is remove the brake calipers on each side. You have 2 screws holding them on, and they're a 10mm 12-point socket. Here you have the wheel speed sensor guide. You just want to make sure you keep track of that. All right, so now it's time to remove the front tire. You just want to keep track of your spacers. I have a spacer right here. These groove lines are facing inboard, so I'll make sure I install it the same way. Then you have your axle, and on the other side, you have your wheel speed sensor. You want to make sure you install this the same way. You don't want to have it flip-flopped. Then you have your axle nut. So what I'll do first is break loose this axle nut. For this axle nut, I'm using a 15/16 deep socket. And then you have a pinch screw on this side on the bottom. I'll loosen that up. For the pinch screw, I'm using a 6mm hex bit. So here, I'm using a center jack to raise the front of the bike up to get some tension off, and then I'll knock this axle through. Here, I'm using a rubber mallet to knock the axle through. You don't want to damage your threads. And I'll just use a screwdriver to pull the axle out the rest of the way. Just make sure you're keeping track of your wheel speed sensor and your spacer. Now I'm not keeping this axle because I am changing it out to the native 25mm black flush axle, but if you are keeping yours, just make sure you keep everything together with your spacer, your washer, and your nut. Now from here, I'll go ahead and roll the tire out. So looking at the stock wheel, on the right side, you do have a steel bearing here. And if you look on the left side for your ABS or wheel speed sensor, you have a plastic, looks like a plastic clear bearing. It's still a solid bearing, you just have this plastic here. Now if you did choose to go with a weighted balanced tire, I do suggest getting a wheel balancer and truing stand. So on this truing stand, you do want it to be level. They do have adjustable feet in case you don't have a level surface. And then you have a bubble indicator here that lets you know if you're level. So this would be your heaviest spot. You would mark up here with a piece of tape along with your weights, and then you do quarter turns. However, there's different ways, different techniques on doing this, but you obviously every time you move this tire any spot, it should just stay where it's at. Now this is balanced from the factory. Over time, these things do shift, just the wear and tear. So yeah, this only has about 1,200 miles on it, I believe, on this tire. If I was reusing this tire, I would go ahead and rebalance it. Not doing anything to the fat front tire because it is bead balanced. But once we get the rotors mounted on to the front tire, I'll check those, I'll get those dialed in just to make sure everything is good on this stand. Let's go ahead and get this off. Let's get these old rotors off. I do want to take these off, compare some weights between the Lyndall brake rotors and the stock rotors. So to take this rotor off, you have 5 screws and they're a T40. So you have your spring washer, you have your hub, and your screw. Now, anytime you're changing out rotors or you're servicing them, you definitely want to change out these screws. Now, on a service note, with anything that involves Loctite on your bike, which is 99% of it, you definitely want to thread chase your holes. Now, even though this is a new wheel, I did thread chase these holes and blew everything out just to make sure that there was nothing in there. Now, before I mount the rotors, I will clean them off. A lot of times these rotors are packaged with a protective film that has any packaging grease or anything like that. You want to make sure you get all that off. Now, some rotors do have an indication or a mark indicating that it needs to line up with the valve stem. This doesn't have that, but if yours has it, just line it up with the valve stem. Obviously, you want your holes to line up. So with my disc screws, I'll throw on some red Loctite. And then when you go to put your screws in, you want to tighten them down in a star pattern. And then you also want to torque them down in a star pattern. You want to do that, that way it sets properly onto the wheel. Now, if you're using your standard stock screws, you're going to torque them down 16 to 24 foot-pounds. So with these Lindall titanium screws, you don't want to torque them down more than 15 to 18 foot-pounds. And to torque these down, I'm using a 7/32 hex bit. So it's going to be the exact same thing on the other side. Now also, you want to inspect your screws, make sure there's no burrs or anything like that that's going to interfere with your mounting hole here. You don't want a bad screw to mess up your threads in here, because then that's just a bad day when you can just replace the screw. All right, so I have the new Lindall rotors mounted onto the fat front tire. I'm gonna go ahead and get the fat tire onto the truing stand. I'm not working on balance because this is bead balance. Don't have to worry about adding any weights. I just wanna make sure that these rotors are true, everything is set correctly. I will check the runout on them. I do have a dial indicator set on the BikeMaster. It's just attached magnetically. I'll check that just to make sure everything is good. Now, it is a little hard with the dial indicator on these rotors just because of all the cutouts, the designs and stuff like that, as you would your traditional stock rotors where everything is flat. You just have a couple holes here and there. Everything looks good to the naked eye, but I just want to confirm and make sure that everything is good to go. So let's get it on here. I'll take these off. I have this one tightened down already. You have your set screws right here. You just loosen them up, and then these can shift. If you have any questions about this O-ring, what I use it for, it's just to keep it from sliding far to the left or sliding far to the right. So I'll take the O-ring off, take this holder off, take this cone off. I'll put my rod through the wheel and we want this cone to sit right inside of that bearing, but what we want is no play in there. So I'll show you how I do it. Just stick the rod through there. Now we want this to be even. So what I'll do is I'll flip it over, and all it is, it's gonna keep pressure on that cone, set it in place. So I can take my other cone, slide it on here. I'll go ahead and tighten it down. I'll go ahead and flip it back over. So we want zero play in that rod and these cones. I'll take my other holder, I'll put this on. Now these don't need to be super tight. You just want to get it down nice and snug. Obviously you don't want them shifting around. So you just set it on those rollers. You can just loosen this up, bring it closer. And with anything else, you want to zero it out. So on this rotor, there's a lot of cutouts. You do have one flat surface right here. So I'll set that dial indicator on that. And what I'm checking for is just oscillation or any type of warping going on. These are brand new, they shouldn't be warped, but I just want to double check and then just slowly turn the tire. That dial indicator is set on there. Everything is looking good. The needle is barely moving. I don't know if you can see it on the camera, but it's barely moving. All right, everything looks good on that one. I'll go ahead and switch it to the other side. Now, obviously this is a new rotor, but it could also be the hub. So if you have a brand new rotor and you have some bad runout, I would check the hub. It could just be a bad bearing. So I do like to make sure I mark on the lever and on the brake pedal not to press or pull the brakes. That way, when these calipers are off, you don't want these pistons to push all the way out and then just making it really difficult to compress them back in. Now from here, I'll inspect my lines, make sure I have no leaks. So I'll take the reservoir cap off to the front brake master cylinder. I'll also take some fluid out. That way it's a little easier to compress these pistons back in and that fluid doesn't rise up and overflow. I'll also take a moisture tester pin and check the fluid to see if it needs to be serviced. So you don't want to stick a screwdriver in here, and especially if you have new brake pads, you're going to have uneven wear if you sit there and start jamming away to compress those pistons back in order to fit your brake disc. Now I do have a brake caliper tool that I use. It is for a car, but it also works on these pretty well. I can get this all the way into here. Now you can put some painter's tape on this side to protect your caliper, but it's been fine so far. And then I just tighten this down and it compresses those pistons evenly. And it'll be the same thing for the other side. You just switch it over, kind of work it in there, tighten this down. So here I'll just take the screen off. You can use a screwdriver, but these pop out pretty easily. Just kind of work your finger under there and it should work right out. Now I do plan on getting these painted in the Eldorado Gold, and you guys will see that later. You have your pin right here, you have your retaining clip. You're gonna pull this retaining clip out. You can just use your fingers or you can use a picking tool, but it should just come right out. And for this pad pin, I'm using a 5mm hex bit. Now the pad pin and the retaining clip, you always want to replace those anytime you're servicing your brake pads. From here, you can just work them out. Here you have your square corner, your pad pin tab, you have your pad pin hole. This is where your pad pin goes through. This is all your friction material. And then you have your wear indicator grooves. So you have your 4 pistons right here. I'll clean these out. I'll use some brake cleaner, just spray this out. You have your pad spring. You can always pull that out, clean that off as well. You can easily just pop it back in, and then we'll get those new brake pads in here. And it's gonna be the same thing for the left side. All right, so from here, I'll clean out these brake calipers with some brake cleaner and a scrub brush, get down in there, get all that dirt and grime out so we can get these new pads installed. So here you have your Lindall Z Plus brake pad. Here you have the Brembo brake pad that we just took off. These are obviously still good. There's only over 1,200 miles on these, but we want to use the Lindall Z Plus brake pads. Any type of Lindall rotors, you want to pair their brake pads with their rotors. So on the back of the brake pad, you obviously have your piston wear marks on here. There was some disc brake quiet. We'll add some of that onto here as well. You don't need to put a lot, and you don't want to get any of that onto your brake pad. So you have your pad pinhole right here. So you're going to want to line that up. This is going to go on this side. So like I said, I'll use a new pad pin and I'll add some anti-seize. Make sure everything is lined up. I'll get this started. I'm going to stick my retaining clip in there. So the torque value on these brake pad pins is 75 to 102 inch-pounds. And it's going to be the exact same thing on the left side. Now when you're mounting this tire, just remember what side was your ABS. Now because this is a fat front tire, that directional arrow is going to be facing the opposite direction. So I'll slowly lower the bike onto the tire until I get the holes to line up. So with this new flush axle, I'll add some anti-seize. I'll also add some anti-seize inside the right axle hole and inside the spacer. I'll also add some anti-seize to the inside of the wheel speed sensor. Now I'll get this flush axle in. Don't forget your spacer and your wheel speed sensor and which way they were orientated. My spacer with the groove lines was facing towards the rotor. And on the wheel speed sensor, this rubber part, which is the wheel speed sensor, the spacer was outboard and that rubber was inboard. So on the wheel speed sensor, you want it to touch and then just back it off a little bit. So to tighten this down, I'm using a 5/8 socket. Double check that wheel speed sensor that it's not turning when you're tightening it down. Now Native Custom Baggers has a torque value for their axle and it's 50 foot-pounds. Now if you're installing your stock axle for this model bike, the torque value is 70 to 75 foot-pounds. So for the flush axle cap on the right side, you have this seal or O-ring. It's gonna sit right inside of here. And once you tighten down the pinch screw, it's gonna tighten down on that O-ring or seal, and it's gonna keep that cap in place. Now the torque value for this axle pinch screw is 18 to 22 foot-pounds. So now I'll remount the left brake caliper, and if you haven't done so already, make sure you thread chase these holes and also clean off your mounting screws. Now for your left caliper, you do have this wheel speed sensor guide. You wanna make sure you install this the right way. You should see some wear marks from the screws on the mounting bracket. It'll tell you which way it was orientated. And once again, I'm using a 10mm 12-point socket to tighten these down. Now the torque value for the front caliper mounting screws is 28 to 38 foot-pounds. Once I get the brake calipers mounted on, I'll go through it one more time, check the clearance between the tire and the fender, and also the rotors, calipers, and brake pads. Now, because the brakes were serviced and this fluid does need to be changed out, I'll go ahead and bleed the brakes. Here, I'm using a MityVac to suck the rest of this fluid out. And when you're putting new fluid back in, you want to use an unopened bottle. I'll take the bleeder screw cap off. I'll pump the MityVac to build some pressure. Here, I'm using a 3/8 wrench to crack open and close the bleeder screw. I'll let some fluid get sucked out. I'll put new fluid back in. Here, I'll pump the brakes to work that fluid in. And I'll do this process about 3 to 4 times on the left and right side. Now that these brakes feel good and the fluid is changed out, I'll put the reservoir cap back on. And I'll clean the area in case I spilled any fluid. Now, something you can do after bleeding your brakes, in case you have any air or bubbles left in the line, you can clamp down your brake lever and leave it overnight. That way those air bubbles will make their way to the top. It's like a big old stop sign. It's a big old stop sign. It's a big old stop sign because they want you to stop. They want you to stop. Performance, gotcha. Regular dude on the bike, gotcha. Want to go fast? I want to go fast. They gotcha.